The American president Woodrow Wilson took a leading role during the post-war peace negotiations. Wilson introduced a series of propositions before the war officially ended that would be known as President Wilson's 14 points. The 14 points were a plan to rebuild the post-war world. In June of 1919, nations convened in Paris to hammer out the details concerning the end of the war. Borders, displaced persons, and reparations were all issues that needed to be resolved. Wilson's idea for an international body of delegates who would resolve issues using diplomacy was rejected by the United States Senate, but went ahead without American participation. American President Woodrow Wilson took the star role at the June 1919 Paris Peace Conference. Also in attendance were British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French President Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. Post-war Germany was being led by Friedrich Ebert, who was holding on to power in a nation drained by war. The peace conference took place on the outskirts of the French capital, with delegates meeting on the grounds of the old Versailles Palace. Versailles was chosen as the venue for the meeting due to its large size. Hundreds of delegates participated in the negotiations leading up to the signing of the final treaty. Wilson had authored his 14 points back in January of 1917, prior to the American entrance into the conflict. The 14 points included calls to end secret treaties, guarantee freedom of the seas, the removal of trade barriers, the reduction of armaments, and the reorganization of barriers and creation of new national states in Europe. Wilson hoped that now the war was finally over, a constructive and lasting peace agreement could be signed. However, bitterness towards Germany would lead to the creation of a very punitive post-war treaty. Wilson, along with Lloyd George and Clemenceau, were considered to be the big three negotiators at the Paris Peace Conference. France had been decimated by the war, and French President Clemenceau was eager to see Germany punished. Lloyd George, Britain's Prime Minister, privately urged a more moderate tone towards Germany. Lloyd George feared that a humiliated Germany was vulnerable to communist takeover. The British public were eager to see their former enemy nation treated harshly at the conference. Thus, Lloyd George conceded to the harsh measures that his French counterpart wanted. Reparations, or payments for damages incurred during the war, were a significant topic. The war guilt clause of the treaty forced Germany to take the blame for starting the war. Many German people found this unfair, since this was the doing of the Kaiser in 1914, not the German people of 1919. Germany was forced to pay Britain and France reparations for the damages each of those allied nations incurred during the conflict. The amount calculated for reparations was originally 132 billion gold marks, although that was later recalibrated when Germany was unable to continue payments after 1922. Germany, along with its ally, Austria-Hungary, would be broken up to create several new independent nations. Germany and Austria were expressly forbidden from forming a political union. 1919 saw the creation of a new European map, one that was designed with the hope of giving once subject people their own nations. Ethnic Poles, whose land had been divided between the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires, were given a new nation. Austria and Hungary were split into two independent countries. The Czech and Slovak ethnic groups were put into a new country called Czechoslovakia. Three independent nations along the Baltic coast were formed called Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Serbia became part of a new country called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes would be led by the Serbian monarchy and later renamed Yugoslavia, meaning Land of the South Slavs. The terms of the treaty were unpopular with the German people, but Germany faced an invasion from the Allies if their delegates did not sign. Along with reparations and territory lost, Germany was forced to cede control of its colonies in Africa. Additionally, Germany had to eliminate its air force, reduce its navy, forfeit all tanks and submarines, and consent to an Allied occupation of the Rhine River Valley. The territories of Saar and Upper Silesia were ceded to France and Poland, respectively. These lands were rich in coal, so their loss deprived Germany of a valuable natural resource. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Another key product of the Treaty of Versailles was the creation of the League of Nations. The League officially formed in January of 1920 and held its first meeting of delegates from member nations in November of 1920. The League of Nations had been the brainchild of American President Wilson. Ironically, the United States ended up not joining the League. Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke that fall. His political opponent, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, set about trying to persuade fellow senators against ratifying the treaty that would allow the United States to join the League. Cabot Lodge argued an isolationist standpoint, meaning that he wanted the United States to isolate itself from foreign entanglements. Joining a body like the League of Nations could potentially drag the U.S. into another foreign conflict. Ultimately, the U.S. Senate failed to ratify to the treaty, so America did not become a member of the League. During the 1920s, the League of Nations was headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, with 42 member nations. Switzerland was chosen at the meeting place because it was a country that had been neutral during the Great War. Back in the United States, the post-war economy picked up after a brief dip in 1919 as the markets returned to civilian production. The American automotive industry continued to grow throughout the 1920s, and consumer spending reached unprecedented levels. While isolationist sentiment remained strong in post-war America, the U.S. did not entirely withdraw from international affairs. In 1928, the U.S. helped sponsor the Kellogg-Briand Pact, a piece of international legislation that rendered war illegal and stated that diplomacy to resolve conflicts must be a priority. The treaty that ended the Great War broke up the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires and created a number of new nations in Europe. Germany came out of the Paris Peace Conference humiliated, saddled with reparation debts and hyperinflation of their currency, the Deutschmark. Europe's transition into the 1930s saw the rise of extremist politics and remilitarization. Let's review this lesson on the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. After the end of the Great War, which new European nations were created? A. Poland, B. Switzerland, C. Czechoslovakia, D. both A and C, or E. both B and C? The answer is D. Both A and C is the correct answer. The war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to take the blame for the war and make payments for damages incurred to Britain and France during the war. The term for these damage payments was A. hyperinflation, B. reparations, C. isolationism, D. Cession. The answer is B, reparations.